Welcome back to Meet Bridget, a show that dives into the often untold teenage and young adult experiences of successful women from all types of backgrounds and in all sorts of careers. This show is an extension of Bridget, a confidence coaching service for young women. I'm Asha Gabriel, and I co host this show alongside my best friend, Kishia Rosenberg. Today's guest is Irene Liu. Irene is the CEO and co founder of Chiyo, a food delivery service focused on Eastern food therapy and nutritional science for each stage of motherhood. Chiyo was created to help mothers feel their best as they step into the magical chapter of life that is motherhood. Chiyo embraces the power of nutrition and does the research, meal design, and delivery so food can be a joyful and adventurous part of your journey. Growing up in a Taiwanese household, Liu learned early on that food can be medicinal, and she spent her years prior to co founding Chiyo focused on solving for healthy food access. She worked at Bain Advising grocery and retail clients, in city government to understand public and private partnerships, and for a community based food access nonprofit setting up mobile grocery routes on Chicago's South Side. Irene and her co founder Jen are Forbes 30 Under 30 list makers and are constantly innovating with their nutritional mission. So, with that, Irene, welcome to Meet Bridget. We're so excited to have you here today.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
So, we love to just dive right in with our interviews. We like to explore what you were like when you were a very little girl. So, as early as you can remember, if you can paint a picture of what it was like to be a little girl.
Yeah, it's funny now at this age because I feel like I've reverted back in some ways or found myself again. But definitely when I was younger, I was very rebellious, very curious, and also just honestly kind of a difficult child. I think that probably I was always questioning my parents, like why we did things a certain way. I was super observant. My parents always tell this story about, I have an older sister, and they always tell this story about how they very clearly saw the difference in our personalities. One July 4th weekend, we went to go see the fireworks, and the fireworks went off, and us two kids went in opposite directions. My sister ran far away, and I ran forward. And then they had to chase after us in different directions. But I think as a result, like it's very telling that I was somebody who was always very curious and very excitable and wanted kind of adventure. And I think that kind of why I say I found myself again is because actually I hadn't planned to be an entrepreneur, never was in my career path or on the horizon. And so a lot of what I've realized is like how much I enjoy being an entrepreneur actually has always been in me and my personality.
I love that so much. Is it just you and your sister?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Siblings? What's your age difference between the two of you?
We're 2.5 years apart.
Okay, that's kind of, I have two daughters, a 2.5-year-old and an 8-month-old right now. And I constantly am already observing these differences in them and they're babies, that so much
Yeah.
is just inherent. But I love hearing how you have this feeling now that you've had a lot of traction in your career. You're like, I'm still that person that I've
Right.
always been.
Yeah.
I
And
love it.
I mean, it's crazy how much personality you can tell at such a young age too. But I've definitely felt like, and we can talk about this a little bit, but I definitely took a very more traditional path out of college. And then kind of over time was like, is this what I want to do? Like I have so many more years of my career. What do I actually find impactful? And now I feel like I know my career is even less tracked than when I was in my early 20s. But I'm even more excited about it.
Yeah, I can totally relate to that experience of kind of trying to do what you think is right or the right path, and try as you might, like you might be successful for a little while, having that kind of pit of your stomach feeling where it's like, but I think I really should be doing something else, and
Mm-hmm.
having to have that transition. So I want to stay on kind of what it was like to be a little girl for you a little bit more, because this, I already feel like there's so many good stories in there. Where did you grow up?
I was in Arcadia, California, it's in the LA area.
Okay, perfect. How was like the school experience for you? Did you like it? Were you academic?
Yeah, I was definitely academic, but I will say I was someone who would get good grades, but I was never the A plus. Like I was always just on the border, like trying to get the A minus and enjoy my life, and like pursue all of my other curiosities. And so it's interesting because I was somebody who actually watched TV for like 2 hours a day just because I was really interested in the storyline and I loved reading, which my parents thought was a big waste of time. But I was like, but I'm getting good grades, so what can you really do?
Well, and it's funny because it's like, okay, actually, there is like mindless TV, but there still is implicitly a lot going on, especially when you're building a company and stuff, seeing commercials and
Mm-hmm.
advertising and stories. It's like, as an entrepreneur, you need to know how to build a brand and promote it. You need to
Totally.
know how to tell a story and grip an audience. So it's kind of like everything you do can feed into where you're going.
Yeah.
Um, as
Yeah.
simple as like watching TV and being into it when you're younger.
Totally. Yeah. And I think also I only realized this much later, but like I had a very active imagination in many
Mhm.
ways. Like I was the one at recess, like making up games, like this game called Puppy, where we'd all pretend to be puppies with like different, and I'd give everyone different roles and create this whole story around it. And I only recently actually realized how that was like a personality or a trait. And like I was the one
Totally,
that was
and being a
always
little director too
right,
is like, "Okay,
right,
this is what you're going to do. This is
right,
how it works. It's all gonna come together like this." I
right,
love that.
right.
So much fun. What were other, like, activities that you were into when you were younger?
I mean, I loved reading. So I spent a lot of time at the library with like my mom or my grandma. Literally was always in the library in elementary school, like taking those like standardized tests, of like testing your knowledge on different books. Um, and always at the dinner table with the book and getting in trouble for that. But
Yeah.
I also did dance, I did theater, I did speech and debate. And so it was a very varied experience for sure. I think what I realized is that I was somebody, and this I realized much later when I'm older, like I had always struggled with, especially in high school, feeling like I didn't have one thing. Like there were some of my friends who their one thing was dance, or their one thing was swimming, or their one thing was, speech and debate. And like they excelled at that one thing. And I was somebody who loved doing a lot of different things, like had five or seven like different extracurriculars at a time, because I just love the diversity of how much I was learning from each one. But I never was motivated to like get to the 100% and be the best in that field. And I feel like I always beat myself up about that, and actually force myself to like choose one thing, after I finished college. Well, after consulting actually, because consulting you're still not choosing.
Yeah.
um,
Love that. We're gonna get into that too because I think there's probably a lot of people that don't really understand what that track looks like, and it's
yeah,
its own animal.
yeah, and like being, and as I've gotten older, just being more comfortable with that and seeing that as a skill too, to be have a lot of breadth and kind of a good enough amount of depth.
Yeah. I mean, I've gone into this with like my therapist about that when you have that, I feel like it's like a gene, like a curiosity gene. Um, that pressure where it's like, why am I not just like one of those people that can just be like,
Mm-hmm.
piano is my thing and I'm going to be an expert like
Right.
concert pianist and everyone like I've been working on this since I was 3. And just being like, I love that idea and I am critical about, not having that kind of commitment to one thing, but also like it is not in my being to be able to cut out all these other things that I'm also interested in, and having them all going at the same time is chaotic, but also like what has to happen, you
Right.
know? And it does take a lot of work to kind of accept that about yourself and be like, this has its, strengths as well,
Mm-hmm.
and I can bring certain things to the table by being this way, that maybe someone who's hyper focused in another thing can't bring to the table.
Totally. Yeah.
I love that. Can you tell us about like your family, your parents growing up? I know from what I know about Chiyo, I know that a lot of what you've done has been inspired by your mother and cooking. Can you tell us a little bit about that dynamic at home?
Yeah. My family is Taiwanese American. My mom actually they immigrated over from Taiwan pretty early. She was like, I think 13 at the time.
Mhm.
So she went to Arcadia High School. Like all of my aunts and uncles went to Arcadia High School, which is really funny and I think rare in this day and age.
Yeah.
And my dad came from graduate school or for graduate school, and he's an engineer. And then my mom worked in accounting and finance. And so it was very interesting because I'll say kind of when they immigrated over, kind of they took more traditional jobs. But my family in Taiwan is actually very entrepreneurial. A lot of them like own their own businesses, or are in business in some way. And then actually my grandpa, my dad's side, was also super entrepreneurial. Started factories, like created technologies, et cetera, et cetera. And he passed away when I was in elementary school, and actually that was around the time that then my dad actually ended his engineering job and then started his own small business. And I think part of it is like being an immigrant entrepreneur is really hard, especially if you're first generation, because a lot of being an entrepreneur, like fundraising, networks, like all of that, you have to start from zero. And so it's funny because in my family, like it's never been encouraged to be an entrepreneur or a small business
Mhm.
owner because, of my dad's experience of seeing like what my parents knew and saw of their generation, it was like nearly impossible. Um, and so I think it's been a lot of learning actually for me and my family. Is like a lot of the times I'm the one that's like traversing this new frontier. Like I didn't know what consulting was, but then I did it. And
Yeah.
like my parents didn't know what consulting was. And they wanted me to go into accounting because that's something that they understood. Or even like going to graduate school, and no one in my
Mhm.
family had gotten, a policy degree before. And then, starting a company and kind of actually, like fundraising for and learning kind of all of the more traditional kind of new ways of building a business, I think
Sure.
has all been really interesting for my family to learn and kind of see and have exposure to like a whole different kind of part of America.
I think that's so, I love hearing stories of, first gen and then second generation immigrant families, because my mom immigrated from India. And I think similarly, when she came here, she saw the path to success. And in that time, it was a lot more, linear. Like if you go
Mm-hmm.
to certain schools, whether you're going to be a doctor or a lawyer or some sort of like finance job, you like get the degree, you get the license,
Right.
you have a guaranteed path. And that was kind of how my parents did a similar, very structured path, but into medicine.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and they encouraged that path, but none of us really actually took it.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also one of the reasons why, and I've talked with my mom about this, especially now we're both like, adults and friends. But we've talked about, as an immigrant, part of coming here is with the hope that your children will be able to surpass you and have freedoms that you didn't see and be able to like take paths that might, you know, be more unique than what, you felt like you needed to do
Mm-hmm.
to break through in America. So
Right.
I think I love thinking about, your parents watching you kind of find your way back to this entrepreneurialism, but have it being a very different experience from a first gen, immigrant entrepreneur experience where it's like you had this foundation of consulting, which we'll get into, which I think a lot of great entrepreneurs have had that foundation because of the all the connections and relationships that it
Mm-hmm.
establishes for
Yeah.
you. I love that. And with your mom, with like cooking and everything, how was it growing up? What was your relationship? Because you have a food-based company, what was your
Mm-hmm.
relationship with food growing up?
Yeah, it's so funny because so we live in Arcadia, or my family does, and my grandparents also live in Arcadia, and so actually food was always like a very big part of how we gathered, like going to my grandma's house to eat lunch every Sunday. And my mom would always be cooking at home. And she always used like a lot of these like medicinal ingredients. But when I was younger, I like, typical, typical kind of like younger, curious and rebellious. I was like, why are we eating these things? Like, what's the nutritional content? Where's the evidence? Like, blah, blah, blah. I'm sure it drove her crazy. And so I think actually, like, I wasn't actually that curious about food as medicine actually until my aunt had a baby the summer of 2020. I was more interested in like healthy food access and nutrition education career wise because I saw such a discrepancy. Actually, when I was in college at Berkeley, I was taking this education class, doing field work in Oakland, and learned about food insecurity and saw how hard it was for them to get ingredients. And so I helped set up a farmer's market at one of the elementary schools. But it was just shocking to see like, oh, people, like I take it for granted when growing up, like we could just go to one of the 5 grocery stores around us. Everything was relatively affordable. There was a lot of options compared to in food deserts, like you don't have, oftentimes people also don't have cars because they're low income areas and they can't get access to a grocery store within a mile, if not more. And so you're forced to eat all this like processed food and has all these health implications. And I think that was really what started my interest in healthy food, because I was like, I can't, like, why doesn't like healthy food just exist for everybody? That's like a fundamental right. And then like kind of the food as medicine and Eastern medicine aspect of it happened more because I saw my aunt go through her postpartum period and my mom sending her these like traditional Chinese medicine postpartum meals. And I was like, oh, this is so fascinating. Like, because it was so specific to a point in time where you knew exactly what you were solving for, like, postpartum recovery, all of the symptoms and mood swings and lactation and all of these very specific concerns, and how the food was combined to help with that, I think was a very different way of how I even thought about food versus just like general healthy food maintenance.
Yeah, I think that you make such a good point because Kashia, my co-host, and I are both postpartum and breastfeeding right now.
Oh, okay.
So firsthand, we're both like experiencing, this is my second baby. So I've kind of had the whole arc and then started again
Mm-hmm.
and, have learned in a lot of ways how important and like demanding, nutritionally demanding, like that breastfeeding period of your life is. It's like, training for an Olympic
Yeah,
sport.
it
It's like
totally is. Yeah.
crazy demands on your body, and it is really hard to get all the nutrition in. It's not as simple as just like popping a prenatal vitamin, like, and
Mm-hmm.
it changes in different like
Yeah,
parts of your experience. So I think it's so cool that you've kind of dialed in on this very specific time. And I mean, as women, I think that there are a lot of like, this is one of the clearest ones where it's like, yes, nutritional needs because you're feeding another human,
right.
but I mean, when we go through um, like getting our periods for the first time and those hormonal
Totally.
changes, or then when we're going through menopause or
Right.
perimenopause and
Right.
those nutritional changes, like our hormones are constantly shifting. Our bodies and cycles and everything are just so sensitive.
Totally. Yeah.
Men have all different cycles and hormones too, but particularly for women, um, I think it's fascinating how much nutrition can play into easing some of
Totally.
those.
Yeah. And like, I think what I found shocking as like, first starting it and then now 2 years in is like how much of a woman's body we don't know and how much we haven't invested in researching and building products that are custom made for women who are going through a very different journey from men. And I think that's also why like there is such a Eastern medicine component to what we do, because they actually have focused on this. And there are like literally, I remember when I got my first period, my mom had me like drink this concoction. It was like really dark and murky and gross, but I drank it, and it was supposed to help with cramps, and you're supposed to drink it after your first period. It's been used for thousands of generations, and like obviously it's hard to say outside of like clinical trials, which all there's actually more and more clinical trials about that and proving out the efficacy of it. But like my sister and I, like I just took that for granted. Like I very thankfully like don't get cramps, and I have very few menstrual issues. But I think that for most people, like you wouldn't have access to that. Like your mom wouldn't be bringing you to the acupuncturist to get these herbal remedies, and like there's no place to learn about it, and especially like the wealth of knowledge that already exists in other countries.
Totally. And I think that globally, it's crazy because you would think like in the US, like we have so many resources, but globally, you know, in all sorts of different countries, they have different methods and like ancient
Right.
practices around pregnancy and birth and menstruation, all these
Right.
things. Um, but we haven't explored and tapped into as much as we can, being an international country and a country of immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
My mom's Indian, and there's the whole like historical Ayurvedic
Mm-hmm.
medicine and like the first 40 days after you have a baby.
Totally.
Um, a lot of similar practices. But I think that sometimes people think that it's like, okay, you have to be Eastern or Western. Like you can't,
Mm-hmm.
integrate like if you think Chinese medicine is the thing, then you can't say any like hospital medicine
Right.
is
Right.
for you. And I think that misses out on a lot.
Totally. Yeah, I totally agree.
Okay, so let's go back so you went to college at Berkeley and you were kind of getting more into food studies, working in your community. What made you decide to go into consulting? And can you paint a picture of just like for someone who has never heard the word consulting before,
Yeah.
um, what that is out of college?
Yeah. It's funny because consulting, when you explain it, it sounds like a crazy job. But basically, you start out like fresh out of college, you have no skills. They just think that you can learn quickly and problem solve. And so you basically are put in, like, I think of it as like you're put in as like a doctor for a corporation. Whatever problems that they're having, you work directly with like the C-level executives to figure out a solution, and you bring kind of like the best practices of like business research, and also like what you've learned from other companies. And so it's a very intense job, both like mentally and physically. But I think you learn a ton, and like gives you so much exposure at such a young age. Like I remember, I think when I started, I was 20, 20, 20 or 21 years old. And I was managing somebody by the time I was 24. And like, for some people, like you don't manage somebody until you're like in your 30s. And I was working directly with
Mhm.
managers when I was like in my early 20s, which is crazy. I also then, did all these things and dressed a certain way and changed how I talked to seem older than I was, for sure. But I think kind of going back to like consulting and that, I'm happy to share like even how I found myself in consulting, because I had no idea what it was going into it. Um, at Berkeley, I was actually a business major. Part of that is because I actually I came in as a history major. Again, like I was very interested in, reading and history and storytelling and all of that. And so I, like, for my parents being immigrant parents, I was like, oh, I'm a history major. They're like, okay, well, what are you going to do with that? You're going to go to law school? Because they didn't know like what else you could do with that. And so my dad was like, maybe you should go like do the business school program, because like it's very practical. There's a lot of options that you can have after that. And so I was like, okay, I don't know any better. So then I did the business major at Berkeley. Also, along the way, joined kind of a professional business fraternity while I was there, also because I didn't know anything. And so I really do think that like Berkeley's business program is very pre-professional. Everybody is working every summer. Also during the school year, the tracks are like you either go into, like most people go into like banking. Some, like at the time, very few people, but growing were going into consulting. But kind of how I found myself there was because I was doing, like, I did an internship at Airbnb actually my sophomore year. Was really lucky to get that. I honestly like didn't know very much about startups at the time. And then for consulting, it was like the summer, like junior year summer, when everyone, like, that's kind of like the summer that everyone's like, oh, this is
Mhm.
the internship that converts to full time, so it really matters, et cetera, et cetera. And I knew I didn't want to do banking. I was like, I don't enjoy finance, and like, why would I put myself through that if I know I'm not going to enjoy it?
Mhm.
And so I didn't recruit for banking, which actually at the time a lot of people said would potentially be a mistake because it was really hard to get a job in consulting. Um, and I just recruited for consulting, which was also stressful in its own way because there were very few spots for consulting. And I ended up working at Bain for that summer. And there's only like 3 of us from Berkeley that got an internship
Mhm.
at Bain. So like it was very unpredictable if I would get it or not. And I also like really didn't bank on that. Like honestly, I didn't think I had
Mhm.
a chance at Bain. I literally didn't. I to the point where I didn't network with anybody at Bain because I just like didn't think that I would get that. And I remember actually talking to one of my professors at the time. It was like a VC PE class. That's venture capital and private equity. And I had actually mistakenly signed up for the class because I just needed to fill my schedule for like 2 units. Ended
Yeah,
up
little did you know.
And then ended up going
That
to
was
that. I know. Ended up going to class the first day, and there was a huge line of people. And like apparently the professor was like super famous, and I actually loved the class, and so I was like, okay, I think I'll stay in this class. But he really was like the most impactful professor I had at Berkeley. Not because I spent a lot of time with him, but more because he gave me so much life perspective at a time that I really needed it. I remember I took a quiz or something, and I also felt very unprepared in that class because I was a junior. Most people were seniors who had gone through banking. I literally didn't know what VC and PE was in that class. I just was like, this is a really interesting class, and I guess I'll learn. It'll be scary, and it'll be whatever. I'll figure it out. I hadn't taken finance yet, so like literally like zero. And I remember I had to work really hard in that class to like literally learn everything that was like so commonplace now if you're in the industry. But I remember meeting him for office hours because I got like a 7 out of 10 on a quiz or something like that. And I remember when I brought it up to him, I was like, okay, like I really want to improve. Like, what should I be focusing on? Like, why did I get this score? Because the way that he would ask the question was like, it was like a 1 line question and you just had to like defend the point,
Mhm.
very blank canvas. And he was like, you're actually like his response to me about improvement. He was like, you're a really good writer. Like, you're very good at logic. You're very good at explaining the point. You're not so good at finance. And I was like, yes, that checks out. and he was like, so what are you thinking about the summer? And I was like, well, I am applying for consulting, but like I heard it's really hard. And so I don't really know. Like, I think I'll just go through the consulting process. And like, if it doesn't work, I'll figure it out. And like, maybe I'll work at a startup for the summer, but I haven't thought that far yet. And he was like, yeah, like it is competitive. Like, I'm not going to lie to you. Like, probably you could get a full-time job senior year. There's more spots for that. But also, like, have you considered being a writer for TechCrunch? And I was like, oh, no, but that sounds really fun. And he was like, yeah, like there's
Mhm.
actually, there are a lot of options out there. And like, you don't have to force yourself into what everybody else says is good or what skills people like of your age think is worth building.
Mhm.
And even though I didn't end up going that route, I think that was like a super healthy way of looking at it and gave me a lot less pressure about going through this consulting process and being like, if I don't get something, like what will that mean about me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's such a great point, and I love that you telling your story of your interaction with him because it's almost like it's you never know when you're going to find someone that, whether you stay in contact with them or not, like they can completely change your life without you even knowing,
Mm-hmm.
if you're just open and like listening and paying attention. But for him to kind of reinforce that, it might seem like it at the time, especially in like these college environments where everyone's scrambling and you're kind of on a timeline. You have to get this thing by the summer. And then it can feel like if I don't get that, I am a failure, and
Right.
there's no other option. And it can be very confusing. But that feeling can block out a lot of other opportunities. And for him to say, like, hey, like, yeah, that could be, you should definitely do that. And if it doesn't work out, there's still tons of things that you can
Mm-hmm.
do and would be great at. Like, what a great critical time for you to hear those words.
Yeah,
I love
totally.
it. So I like to get really granular during these times of life because a lot of our listeners are young women. Some are, going into college or finishing college. At Berkeley, when you were applying for these internships and jobs, how are you applying? What for the jobs that you got interviews on? How did that process go? Were you submitting an application online or using a career center? And
Mm-hmm.
then what were your interview processes like?
Yeah. So I'll start with like sophomore year internship because that is a very different process from junior year internship. Sophomore year and actually I did a freshman year internship too, but like freshman and sophomore year, there's like no tracks, like there's no
Yeah.
like there isn't really like on campus recruiting. You're kind of just like seeing listings and then or hearing about something from an alumni that passed it down or something like that. And so it was very, very fluid, very hard to nail down. I think my first summer was basically like a listing on the career center. It was unpaid. I would take the subway, or what is it called? The subway in LA, the metro,
Mhm.
um,
Yeah.
from Arcadia to West Hollywood. But it was a startup. I just like didn't really have any conception of that in influencer marketing. And so kind of that was like freshman year. I just like applied and then they took me, but also it was unpaid. So like, was the bar that high? Probably not. And then
And honestly, sometimes those can be like the most like juicy, interesting
right,
opportunities.
right.
Not always, but don't discount something because it's unpaid because
Yeah,
you'll
no,
learn a
that's
lot.
true. That's true. Yeah. And then the second year, I was actually having a really hard time my second year recruiting because basically I was in this business fraternity. The kind of typical jobs that were coming in were like finance related, like working at a PE firm as like an analyst or something, or like a VC firm, or honestly, I couldn't even tell you like other types like that, or like an intense like banking job at like a small bank.
Mhm.
Um, and I was having a hard time probably because I just like wasn't passionate about it. So like my cover letter was like not that great. I had no relevant experience. And I remember actually what ended up happening was somebody had sent along. So like I think most of my friends already had internships lined up by the time I was like I got my Airbnb one. This was around May or maybe earlier April of that year. Um, and basically I had kind of like not really been getting interviews for a lot of these like financy jobs. And probably
Mhm.
at that time, like I wasn't looking further, right, compared to like what my professor had told me to do my junior year. And so the Airbnb listing, I think, went up like relative at the startups. So like startups always are a bit later, but somebody had sent
Yeah.
a posting around, and so I interviewed for it, and then miraculously got it. I'm still very good friends and keep in contact with my manager there. But I honestly think that I got really lucky to not have had an internship yet lined up, that the timing worked, had actually, now that you say this, like had worked at a startup previously that was like VC backed, and I had no idea my freshman year. So probably like that was
Mhm.
like also relevant experience. And so that, and I had a great time at Airbnb, learned a lot. But I think what I learned from Airbnb for myself was that I needed to be at that phase of my career and life. Like I felt like I needed a bit more structure and training in order to be impactful in that environment, which is why I went to consulting the following summer and didn't like continue down this startup path because I like didn't really know what the promotion track would be there, and also like what my role and my value add would be at that age and training. And honestly, like I think Airbnb helped me a lot with getting interviews my junior year. And when I would be in my final round interviews, people would ask me about two things. Like they were asking me about either Airbnb or working at the farmers market in Oakland. And so I think it's like even from that experience, like what are interesting jobs or interesting things that you're doing outside of the normal track that really gets people's attention.
I love that. I know that when you're interviewing for consulting, the structure of the interview, do they do case interviews in an
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
undergraduate level too?
Mm-hmm.
I know a lot of my friends from business school went back to the consulting track out of like as MBAs, but it's like a very unique process where you learn how to basically like problem solve
Mm-hmm.
by following a case. Like basically they'll give you a scenario and they want to see like how you think through a problem. It's not necessarily whether you get like a right answer, but they want to see basically how your mind works.
Right.
And that's what they're hiring for. They're hiring for people that can think on their feet, that can think outside the box, that can be very structured in their communication of their
Mm-hmm.
thought processes. It's really like a fascinating interview process beyond the like, tell me about yourself and
Right.
when was a time where you led a group, the traditional, interview process. So for girls that are interested in that, know that it's its own beast, but you might be really good at it and not even know.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah,
to
totally.
look
And
into.
like I also started prepping for my consulting interviews like quite late compared to my friends who were going through consulting. Like I remember one of my friends like knew he wanted to do consulting like from the beginning, started prepping in September when January, February is when interviews start for that summer. And I started literally in December because I was like not sure yet. And I was like focused on getting good grades in my classes. And so like I had to learn at like warp speed. Like I ended up, I think that December, like I would do 2 cases a day with different people live. I kind of just like went straight into it. I think this is kind of my approach to everything is just like start it and get feedback as quickly as possible. Because like that's the way that you learn most quickly. And then also like with the case interview, a lot of it is yes, there's like some preparation that you should do and listen to, Victor Chang, I think was what I don't know if people still
Yeah.
use it, but back in the day that was what was used. Um, but I think there's some element of also just like being present. I think for me that was really important going into the interview so that I could think on my feet and not try to like come up with a formula that I had heard from another interview, like kind of understand the building blocks and then be able to like be present and really understand the question and answer logically.
I love that. Are there any things that you do? Because I think that that's a quality in really almost any career path that is so valuable is being present, especially when you're working with a team or leading or
Mm-hmm.
solving life problems. The ability to just be fully there and show up not in the past or in the future, but right in the present. Do you have any practices or things that help you be better at that?
Yeah. I mean, I think one is just awareness of it. Like, are like asking yourself before you step into the call, like, okay, why? Like, what's the purpose of this call? Like, do I know exactly what I want to get out of it? Is number one. And the second thing I think is like if I do feel very overwhelmed, like I'm a big list maker, so I'll just write it down, park it, revisit it later. But I think probably for me, the more important thing was just like awareness of like, what does it feel like to be present and be able to react impactfully in the meeting versus kind of like scatterbrained or asking people to repeat things and et cetera, et cetera. I think that was also, that's also probably something that you learn from observation as well. Like I had managers at Bain that like some were really good at being present, they had like 5 million other things going on, and others were like, I feel like I was repeating myself 5 times and like
Yeah.
just knowing the difference between the two and wanting to be a good example for whoever I was with.
I love that. It's like being aware of your surroundings and your role models, but also of yourself.
Mhm.
I know you mentioned that while you were at Bain, you worked with a lot of like retail or grocery clients. Were there any that were sort of like case studies that you drew information from as you were starting Chiyo?
Um, I think I would love to say yes, more so, but I think that at the scale we were working with our clients at, they were like huge at that point, and
Yeah.
so a lot of it was like optimization. Um,
Mhm.
and so I think that type of work will probably be more helpful going forward. But I do think I learned a lot of skills out of consulting that is super relevant to what we do now. Like, I think one, like I never really thought about like setting strategy or like being able to prioritize quickly, or setting up a process and experimentation, like how and and even like how to gather information. So important in consulting. You learn how to do it very quickly. There's a whole formula of like best practices around that. But like what an important skill that was for the early days for us. It's like if I have a question and I don't know how to do it, like who are 5 people that I get in contact with to ask the question? Like a quick Google, what does that tell me? And it sounds very simple, but I think it's just being able to like structure and prioritize the work.
Totally. I think that so there's a lot of people that can identify with that entrepreneurial spirit, the curiosity where it's like, I just feel like I'm destined to start something. But I also feel like those people tend to have, they're like idea people in a lot of cases. They're
Mm-hmm.
people that are really excitable and can get behind something and get other people behind them. When you started Chio, how did you know that, like, what work did you do internally to know, like, this is the concept, this is the idea, this is what I should be leading? How did you kind of put all of those um, pieces into your formula before you started?
Yeah, it was messy. So I guess some backstory, and I said this a little bit earlier, was like I never planned to start my own company or be the CEO. I literally like that summer of 2020 when I saw my mom taking care of my aunt, I was just like, oh, like this just makes sense. Like, why doesn't this type of service exist? And so I was very driven by curiosity, and so I was like, I literally then that night like wrote up a whole business plan essentially, but it wasn't really for the purpose of like starting the business. It was just like if I had a business, like everything was so conceptual. Like if I had a business, like what would it look like? What would it be called? Like it was kind of like a fun exercise for me. And then I kind of did it the consulting way. Like I sent out a survey to like a bunch of my friends and asked them to pass it on to other people that were in this life stage, and got a bunch of data back, about like pricing and configuration and the customer behavior. But I think what was interesting is like I still didn't know. Like I was like, okay, like I think I need to do a pilot and see are people willing to pay for it, and what does it need to taste like? How does it need to be marketed? And so then I got connected with my co-founder Jen. We did a pilot that fall. So this was now fall of 2020. We did like a 5-week pilot, and still I wasn't sure. I was like, okay, like it seems like there's something here. I'm not quite sure. The product isn't quite there. People are willing to pay, but like there's a lot more that needs to be figured out here. And so we had paused that pilot, and I had actually planned to do a fundraise or something that fall, or sorry, that December. So I started having some conversations, because I was like, okay, we need some money to like really, put in research and development and, have a bigger team to actually do this correctly and scale it and et cetera, et cetera. And then I started having conversations, maybe like one or two with like people I knew that worked in investing. And I was like, oh, okay, this is impossible. This is going to be an uphill battle. Like nobody believes that this is something people want. A lot of the investors like haven't gone through this life phase, like don't really see how big the market could be, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And so that was December. And then kind of miraculously, but also shows what a gap in the market, we ended up getting like thousands of dollars in pre-orders that December when we were closed. And when we
Mm,
looked into it, like, where is this coming from? Because we are literally silent.
yeah.
We were the first organic Google search result. that literally happened like overnight in December. And we're like, oh my God. And so like, we weren't really thinking. We were just like, oh my gosh, like they're newly postpartum women. Like we need to get this up and running. Like we can't deliver it to them like 3 months later.
Yeah, I was like, we'll be there soon.
Right. So then we literally just cobbled it together, like not thinking truly. Like we were like, okay, like how do we get a kitchen team? Like, how, like what space do we get? And we ended up, getting these like Michelin star chefs that were out of work from like another contact. And then we were at a restaurant that had a day off. So we used their day off in the kitchen until we could find a longer term kitchen. And so everything was like, then like once January, then it kind of like at every point we just like kept building on top of it. And this was still me and Jennifer, like I was still in school this whole time, full-time graduate school. And we had no full-time team. Chefs that kind of were like part-time, delivering once a week. Jennifer still had her nutrition practice. And so it was very, very much cobbled together. And part of it was like we got a New York Times feature, a Bon Appetit feature, all in our first quarter. And so that was when I was like, okay, there's really like something here. It's not just like in the abstract. It's not just research. Like people are literally paying us and writing about us, which is crazy. But I think that actually even then, I wasn't sure if I wanted to run it. Like, I think that there is a little bit of like two things. Like one, I hadn't thought that hard about like what type of business, if I did run a business, what type of business would it be? What would keep me motivated for at least 5 years to build it? And because the business had started so quickly and kind of like snowballed, I was like, okay, am I going to be happy running this type of business in 2 years, in 5 years? And at that point, like the answer was no, because at that point I could only see the business as a meal delivery business, for like the postpartum period. And I was like, I'm not an optimizer, like how I said earlier, yeah. Right? Like the best type of founder, if it was a postpartum meal delivery service, is somebody that is very good at ops and efficiency. I am not that. I've never done physical products. I'm also not a mother. And so at the time I was like, I don't think that I'm the right person to run this. And like, I don't think that I would be happy focusing on like operational efficiency every day, to run this company. And so that was kind of like the of 2021. I was still working on it, but like really thinking about it critically, still doing it part-time. And it wasn't actually until fall that I was actually taking a social entrepreneurship class in my policy program, and talking about like, okay, because I think what it unearthed for me actually starting Chiyo was like, oh, I actually really like entrepreneurship. I really like creating something out of nothing. I think it's really fun. But then I think the question was like, but is this the business that's right for me to build? And like, do I feel like I can build it authentically in a way that aligns with my values? Because I think the things that were hard for me to swallow was, one, like it is a more premium product, and I didn't really know what the path to accessibility would look like, because like, you know, my background, like I worked at food access nonprofits, like I worked in city government, like it just felt like I didn't want to build this like high cost premium, convincing people that they needed something that they didn't type of business. And I didn't really see a path outside of that if I needed it to get funding and, you know, get it up and running and have high margins and stuff like that. And so then that fall was when I was taking that social entrepreneurship class, and really like I was writing this like 25-page final paper that I couldn't think of what to write about. So I was literally just like, you know, like word vomiting on this essay, examining other types of businesses and what I found really inspiring about it, and what type of business would I want to be building that I would be really proud of. And then what I realized was like, oh, actually, like maybe I can build all of this within Chiyo. I just hadn't seen it that way. And I assumed that like if I needed to get funding for it and appease investors and things like that, like that I'd have to build it a very specific way. But what if I just tried it my way and like see if that works? And like if it doesn't, I tried my best. And if it does, then great. Like I've created a new example of what social entrepreneurship can look like.
That is so amazing. I think that as when you're starting out as an entrepreneur, there can kind of be like two pressures. You're like, okay, entrepreneur, and you like look up like what does it mean to be an entrepreneur? And okay, what is venture capital? And like how do I get funding and Series A and this and that? Like,
Mhm.
and how do I pitch and everything? And half of it can be like, okay, how do I get all these like heavy swinging investors to like believe in my pitch? And then the other half is like actually running your company and a team and making sure it's viable and getting your customers pleased. And it's sort of like, okay, where do I put the majority of my time? And I think that in a business, especially one that is around this postpartum period, it's a very niche, it's a
Mhm.
niche market with high and urgent needs, but
Mhm.
most of the investors, unfortunately, still, there's been a little bit of headway, but unfortunately, most of the investors in that venture capital space are men. They're definitely not women that are having babies and having these kind of nutritional needs. But a lot of products, I've heard some stories of other women creating women-centric products and going into some of these rooms, and they're just like, no, don't get it.
Right.
So
Right.
I like how even whether it was intentional or not, you know, the traction started forming from your customers and people really like calling out to you to create this product further, that was like, okay, well, let like the proof be in the pudding, or in
Right.
the delicious Eastern food is medicine meal. But that demand, it's like, well, whether or not these people believe me, or whether I fit this specific criteria to be investable, this is a product that
Mhm.
people are needing, and I can run it my way with like mission, and bring what my passions are into this product, while still having it be profitable and runnable as a business.
Mhm. Yeah, totally.
That's so great. Where does the name Chiyo come from?
Yeah, so it is a Japanese baby name, but basically it means thousands of generations or eternal, which is very much like the philosophy of how we think about care.
I love that. Did you guys have, I think I saw that it was named something else
Um,
before.
Before it was named Nori, and that literally I came up with the night I had the idea, so we did not invest a lot of anything into that. But what ended up happening was like we always knew that we were going to do a rebrand because like I literally thought of it that night and just ran with it. Um, but then we got a cease and desist actually last fall from a company also called Nori that was going into prenatals. Um, I don't think that is confidential. I'm not sure. Maybe that should
Hmm.
be edited out. Anyways,
We can.
we had a cease and desist, and so we just pulled up the rebrand earlier.
I love it. So I have kind of two more things I really want to dive into. One, so you have a co-founder,
Mm-hmm.
and that dynamic, I think that clearly you guys have been working together for a long time. Can you tell us a little bit about the process of working together successfully? Any different traits and things that you bring to the table, or issues that you've had working together, and how you've communicated and navigated that?
Yeah, definitely co-founder relationship is like a marriage, as everyone says. I think some context on like where we come from is helpful. Like my co-founder is, a nutritionist, and she used to work in tech way earlier than that, but like technically, kind of how she spent her last like 7 years is like as a nutritionist in the birth community, and so very much like more fluid in the way that she works versus for me, like I came from like very high intensity types of backgrounds. And so I think, and I have a very specific way of like, I'm very direct and like getting feedback and like giving feedback and like very growth mindset oriented. And I think that was just like not the environment that my co-founder was used to. And, giving and receiving feedback also wasn't like kind of like the norm in her every day. And so I think there was like definitely some kind of getting used to each other's styles, creating the culture around giving feedback that was super helpful, and also spelling out like what good looks like, what process looks like, what like speed is expected for communication. And I think that's all things that are part of like a healthy relationship generally. Like even if you think of like your romantic relationships, you're kind of
Yeah.
like creating these norms for being together. And I think that was something that we had to do very early on. Also because like we didn't have, like I literally like cold reached out to her to like do this with me because I knew that she had like the relevant expertise. But as a result, we've like really worked on it together. And I feel like we've over time built like a really trusted relationship where we are giving each other like very direct feedback and kind of like can take the emotion out of it. But I think at the end of the day, what really helped us is that we just really believed in the mission of what we were building and just believed that it needed to exist. And so kind of seeing that as like the long-term goal, that then like all of the little things in between aren't as important.
I think that's so so critical when you think of like co-founders, when you're talking about you know, you clearly need to agree on that mission, both be committed in the same extent, see like, okay, this is entrepreneurship, so there's going to be some bumps in the road. So
Mm-hmm.
like have that commitment. It is almost like a marriage where it's like we're signing on for this.
Right.
But also knowing that like having different skills that you bring to the table is actually like a great thing. Like you don't want everyone to look. Sometimes I think people are building teams and it's like, okay, I need to just recreate myself and bring a lot of me's to the table, but then you're really missing out on
Mm-hmm.
a lot of really, really important things. So
But,
finding someone that like believes in the mission the same way you do and is willing to like, you know, work with you, but also brings like things that you don't have to the
mm-hmm.
table.
Yeah,
That's amazing.
definitely.
So everyone knows, you know, entrepreneurship has ups and downs. Can you tell us about maybe one moment that was like a total up, where it was like, oh my gosh, like a kind of we've made it moment or
Mm-hmm.
some validation, and then maybe also a moment that you felt like this all is lost kind of
Yeah.
emotion and how you.
Um, I'm trying to think. Okay, so I think the first kind of like the big win, I think, was getting, we were featured in Fortune in January of this year. And I think that was like super validating and impactful because, you know, as much as like we are very confident about what we're building, like we are building with our community, I think what Fortune opened up for us was like, okay, like now the business community sees the potential here and the need in a way that previously it felt, and I said this before, like when I was, you know, having my first conversations in like December of 2020, I was like, oh, it was an uphill battle. Like this is never going to work. But I think what Fortune did was like got us the audience that, you know, Fortune has, but also validated that like this can be a viable business, that it's serving a need, that, you know, they are, you know, doing well in terms of revenue and growth. That then opened up a lot of doors for us and a lot of exposure to a different audience. So I think that was one. And then the second was probably this was like, I think April of 2022, when it all felt like it could fall apart. What happened was basically I was, you know, still in full-time school, fundraising right before I graduated in May. The day that I closed our fundraise in April of 2022, and my co-founder Jennifer just had a baby literally that week, and so kind of in the interim, like who was running kind of like kitchen operations, we had a head chef that had been working with us for probably like 2 months at that point. And that same day, she emailed me and said she was quitting. And we're like, oh my God, because literally Jennifer was like 1 week postpartum. She, like,
Yeah,
the chef said that she was like over it and was literally like, I had to like beg her to stay for even like 3 days to like help with the transition as I like found a new team. Um,
yeah,
and, and I had just gotten off fundraising that Friday and being like, we're going to use all this money for XYZ and expand. And I'm like, oh, actually, no, we're like, start over and like build out our operations again. And I think what was hard was like, obviously, like I was out of the business for like 2 months fundraising. And I think our chef, like I fully understand why she she was over it and quit. Like, it was a hard job. We were asking her to do a lot with very little. And I think like it had just taken longer than she had wanted to like get signed on full time, because I was like, fundraising took a bit longer than I expected to. But I think that what was hard was like, I think for us, like then being like, okay, what do we do now? Like, I wanted Jennifer to have a maternity leave, but also we were, worried about, can we actually pause this and like start back up again? Like, is that actually feasible when we already have customers? And I think what we ended up doing was like, Jennifer literally was like, I think that it just needs to go on, and like I want to be in the kitchen next week. And so kind of helping her with that. But then I was like trying to figure out, getting chefs basically over that weekend, like Craigslist, postings on Facebook, asking other friends in the industry, and like trying to support where I could, and then like coming in between classes. And so, yeah, it was a chaotic time, but basically I think kind of us getting over that hurdle really showed us like we can solve anything and like it will always look better in 3 months.
Totally. And I mean, just wild that it's also in her immediate postpartum, you know, time
Yeah.
that it's like that all of this stuff kind of came together. But that's like the reality of kind of postpartum, is like everything is redefined, and what you think you need like isn't there, and things don't show up, and then you kind of have to figure it out. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like that is like a big metaphor for what the experience of, you know, having a complete transition to be becoming a mother, that even though this was a hard time for your company, it, is built into the way that you guys are able to integrate and understand, getting over hurdles and finding community and working through it together is what I
Totally.
love that.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we like to kind of, I feel like we could just chat all day, but I don't want to use up all your time. So we like to transition at the end of our interviews into just a quick, casual, fast 5 questions. So I'll ask them and just say whatever comes to mind.
Okay.
Number 1, what is your comfort food?
Oh my gosh. At this point it's broth.
Love it. Any kind of broth? Like, is it
like
a
a
like a
like
bone
a
broth?
seaweed miso broth.
Yeah, love it. With all this rain you guys are having up. Oh wait, you're in New York right now, actually,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, so it's
Well,
actually
we're having some rain over here. I love it. Okay, number 2 is, what is your favorite food as medicine? So relate.
oh my gosh. There's so many. I think that probably ginger.
Mhm.
I just always feel better after I have like a ginger tea, or even like I like to eat the ginger strips on their own, with like sushi or things like that.
So good. Number 3 is, what is the most used item in your kitchen?
I'm trying to think. I actually forget to salt my food often. But I do like this, like, it's like a yellow, it's like a spice blend, but it's Japanese. But it's kind of like a tangy yellow, like citrusy blend.
Yum. Okay. Number 4, what is one thing or an idea, a book, anything that you've been really passionate about recently?
Actually, I've been rereading recently, Defining Decade. I read it actually in my early 20s, when I was first starting consulting, and then have been revisiting it now when I'm, in my late 20s, almost 30, to see if I'm like having different takeaways this time around.
I love it. We're going to put that in our show notes. Number 5, what is the best piece of advice that you've been given?
Um, it was when I was debating actually starting a company or like joining one. And this was like the fall of 2021. And I spoke to another founder, and he was like, why work for someone else? Like, he was like, you know a lot, like give yourself credit, and like no one knows more than you. They just have time. And I was like, oh, okay, I guess I should just do it.
I love it. Be bold. Okay, for our final question, this one's a little bit more serious or reflective, but we always love to ask, what was one quality that you had as a young woman or teen that you maybe didn't take pride in then, but looking back, you appreciate so much more now?
Um, yeah, I think I've always had really um, healthy self esteem. And so I like build my own confidence from like trying something, failing, but then sometimes succeeding in a way that like I don't rely really on other people for my confidence or assurance if I'm like on the right path. And I think that's really served me well to just like listen to myself and take action on things that I feel passionate about. And I wish that I had probably like leaned into that even more when I was in high school and college.
That is so beautiful. We love, obviously, we're a company all about the development of confidence. And the etymology of the word confidence comes basically from roots that mean self-trust. And I think that confidence can kind of have a really external perception when you think of the word, but really, like you were saying, from a young age, being able to trust yourself in the way that you handle different things and live your life.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really the building blocks of confidence itself.
Amazing.
So, Irene, thank you so much for being here with me. I loved our conversation, learning about your background and Chiyo. Where can people learn more about Chiyo, sign up, and learn more about you?
Yeah. So our website is wearechiyo.com. Also hashtag, or so not hashtag, at on Instagram is also we at Chiyo. Or we are. Sorry, I
Perfect.
said that wrong. It's that. It's at we are Chiyo. And also our website is
Perfect.
wearechiyo.com.
Chiyo is spelled Chiyo, because I know this is a
Mm-hmm.
podcast, might not be looking at it, but Chiyo. And thank you so much,
Thank you.
Irene. We can't wait to talk to you again soon.